Hi, my name is Elliot Robinson-Cortez, and I think that one of my biggest and main inspirations for writing my topic about Native Alaskan language revitalization uh, would be because I am interested in languages, studying multiple and studying one fully in depth, meaning studying the politics and the cultures embedded in that language. But overall, I do enjoy language in general. And I think one of the most interesting things that we came upon during this semester is when we studied Alaskan or Alaskan Native languages in terms of revitalizing and helping the students of Native Alaskans to succeed in Western society as it is. And I feel like that was what I excelled at, and that's currently what I still excel at is languages. So that's why I wanted to do a topic that I actually would fully enjoy and enjoy writing about. Um, and one of the biggest things that we have talked about in language revitalization in general is the death of a language. Now, on National Public Radio, Chief Marie Smith was told to be the last AAC native speaker, and she died in 2008. And this is very tragic because with the death of a language, the nuances and subcultures tend to also disappear. Um, Now, with things like, or with languages such as Latin, um, that might have not that might have not happened as quickly as, I mean, Latin is still technically spoken, or taught, I should say, but it's not spoken. Um, there are still a lot of things that a lot of people do not know about Latin and are not known to the world because the language of Latin is actually gone. So just like AAC, the language itself is known, but the cultures and the nuances that were embedded in the language are going to wane as the last generation of speakers disappear. So it's just like English. So if English were to die or if English were to die in the next 20 years, the last generation, when they leave or when all of them are gone from the world, then what will have the culture will be in storybooks and history books, and that's it. So this is very tragic because it's not something that we can help. It's the death of the language and what happens with it. We can't help what happens afterwards, but we can help to deter it and to change that. Now, Lane and Donovan, who were part of that NPR or National Public Radio show at that time, who spoke about Chief Smith, actually were learners of a language. Well, Lane was a learner of a language, um, and he was trying to learn his heritage language, as he doesn't actually speak English as a native or as a first language, but he does speak another native American language instead. So he tried to learn that Native American language, and when he tried to learn it, the native speakers themselves um, thought it was shameful for him to try to learn the language, and he specifically says that when he was trying to learn the language, the people would not speak their own languages in the public eye. So instead of him speaking to them right outside their house, for example, they would take him inside the house in order to speak with them uh, because they thought it was a bad idea to speak it out in public, and they thought it was shameful, and they thought that they would be looked down upon. And that's actually it's pretty sad to see that native speakers would feel that way about teaching other speakers of their language. So, regarding language revitalization, I think one of the biggest places to start at would be at the laws. The laws kind of can hinder and actually help revitalize languages. So it's in hinder or help. It's one of those. And in the United States, there are actually four main laws, acts, or statutes that we can draw from in order to see what is actually affecting language revitalization and language usage within the Native Alaskan people. Um, the first and most important of these laws would be the NALA. The NALA is the Native American Languages Act, and the NALA sought to acknowledge that language endangerment was a prevalent subject that had to be breached, and in this way, the government wanted to step in and be a part of the conversation of revitalizing language. And this acknowledges that there is a monopoly that the state has suppressed Native American languages, especially Native Alaskan languages, um, and their culture and the people. The second law or act that we're looking at is the Bilingual Education Act. Now, the Bilingual Education Act is derived from the Title VII or Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And although it's fairly old, it's still pretty relevant. The basic premise of this act is to provide funds for school districts to enable them to create and realize transitional bilingual education and English as a second language programs in those schools. So it allowed them to kind of have English and another language to take part as a dual learning environment in the schools. The third is the Bilingual Bicultural Education Statute. Um, this statute builds on the success of the UPIC bilingual programs that were formed prior to that statute being um, being established. And this statute required school districts to provide schools that had at least 8, which were originally 15, limited English proficient students with programs for languages. Now, that's a mouthful. It just means that any school that had at least 8 students that were not um, native language speakers of English could be provided with programs for languages in that school. The most notable, I would say, is the No Child Left Behind, and it's less so notable but more so notorious because although it did allow disadvantaged students to receive the opportunity to receive an education, it also put them at a disadvantage, especially for those that were of Native Alaskan background. And it puts them at a very high disadvantage because it put strict requirements on English language testing, and they became inconsistent with the needs and goals of native language immersion programs that were designed to support language revitalization and maintenance. And basically, this is just saying that most schools were required to test so harshly on English based on this program that they weren't allowed to teach, or they didn't have the time afforded to them to teach another language because they had to teach to the test of the NCLB. So now that we've spoken about laws, we can kind of move on to what a language shift actually is. And the language shift is based on Lacey Wyman's definition. Language shift is the changing of a language when languages become less common, and basically it's when the youth begin to not speak that language and then speak another language such as English. And the shift can happen gradually, and it usually occurs due to the changes in common thought. And it just doesn't happen overnight because it has to be a long-term process, and long-term could mean 10 years or 20 years. But it could also mean 5 or 7 years. it just can't happen within the period of 1 year. So that's why I said earlier that linguistically speaking, quick would be 10 years, so to say. Um, Now, Wyman also coins the term survivance, and survivance is used to describe how teaching and learning pertain to the growth of a community when under stress. So basically, how uh, their learning environment kind of changes with the community when they're growing and as they're being put in this great stress and pressure. Um, Now, linguistic survivance specifies practices connected to community knowledge, indigeneity, and self-determination in a society full of inequities and challenges, including language endangerment. Um, Now, why is language shifting so dangerous? Well, language shifting is dangerous because that's what leads to the loss and death of a language. The other reason that a language shift is so dangerous is because by the time that we notice the language shift happening, it's usually too late. At that point, trying to revitalize and change that language shift um, becomes a really big problem. It becomes very hard for us to control it. Um, so, some statistics to know that we're not very taught about. They're not very they're not very well known to society is Yupik and Siberian Yupik are the most heavily spoken Alaska Native languages. So when people think, oh well, there are a lot of languages or Native Alaskan languages still spoken, they're probably thinking of Yupik or Siberian Yupik. It's because they have the largest community base in Alaska. Um, and on top of that, there are still 10 Native Alaskan languages that are no longer spoken in school. Um, and then there are currently 8 in a language shift, so they're in the process of being lost as we know it. And for 10 Native Alaskan languages to not be spoken in school is a huge statistic. Um, that's like English not being taught in any school. It's an insane number. So in order to mitigate the language shift that I've been talking about, first we have to determine the fluency of the learners, so the fluency of the youth that are currently speaking it still, and the adults, and then determine what languages that are shifting currently, so that we can pinpoint what languages to help revitalize and to create programs for. And a big way to get into this is immersive teaching. So have them use the language commonly in their everyday life, have their parents help, have the community help. So instead of just teaching the language at school, we also teach it, or we also use it at home. So if someone were to go and learn Spanish in school and then not speak it at home, it wouldn't be very useful. But if we were to have someone speak, um, like for example, AAC, I mean, if there were still students learning it, if we were to have students go home and use it with their parents and with someone at the drugstore, it would be totally um, conducive to revitalizing language. Um, this also goes in turn with gathering the community, so immersion in all aspects, and then having the full community take part in this revitalization process. And it just goes to say and show how big of an impact the whole community can have on revitalizing language. Um, but in conclusion, language shifts are dangerous to society because they are usually too little too late um, by the time that we notice them. And language revitalization is a group effort and requires constant effort, so we can't just put in say 2 years worth of effort. It's a continuous everyday effort. We have to continue it once we see it happening, and then continue it even after that in order to maintain the language throughout the surviving youth. Thank you.